Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Joseph Francis Burton left a comment on last week's meditation. He said that he was trying to remember, but he felt quite sure that George Henry Lewes, George Eliot's partner, she would say husband, other people wouldn't be as generous in her time, although she and Lewes had many more happy years together than a lot of other husbands and wives, but that's getting off topic. Joe said he was sure that George Henry Lewes' funeral was held in a Unitarian chapel. Of course, we were talking, weren't we, last week about Unitarians. Now, I went back to Rosemary Ashton's biography, and I can confirm that, yes, George Henry Lewes' funeral was held at Rosslyn Hill Chapel, which is located in Hampstead, which is a borough of London. And George Eliot herself didn't attend. That's how distraught she was. While Lewes was alive, Eliot did attend the Rosslyn Hill Chapel for a service at least once. She went because George Henry Lewes' son Charles and his wife were visiting, and they were practicing Unitarians. Well, that's my little digression over. Now, on to the meditation. We'll do what we did last week, which I think worked really well. I'm going to read through the section of the text that we're covering completely. Just a nice read. I enjoyed that. I actually found it easier to do that than to stop and start and stop and start, which I do think you tend to forget what it is that you've covered. So I'm going to read the whole thing. Then we're going to go back and talk about specific points that I want to bring out as part of the meditation. We're starting at about 2/3 of the way down page 184. You don't set up Fairbrother as a pattern of what a clergyman ought to be, I hope, said Mr. Larcher, the eminent carrier who had just come in. I have no ill will towards him, but I think we owe something to the public, not to speak of anything higher, in these appointments. In my opinion, Fairbrother is too lax for a clergyman. I don't wish to bring up particulars against him, but he will make a little attendance here go as far as he can. And a devilish deal better than too much, said Mr. Hawley, whose bad language was notorious in that part of the county. Sick people can't bear so much praying and preaching, and that methodistical sort of religion is bad for the spirits, bad for the inside, eh? He added, quickly turning round to the 4 medical men who were assembled. But any answer was dispensed with by the entrance of 3 gentlemen, with whom there were greetings more or less cordial. These were the Reverend Edward Thesiger, rector of St. Peter's, Mr. Bulstrode, and our friend, Mr. Brooke of Tipton, who had lately allowed himself to be put on the board of directors in his turn, but had never before attended, his attendance now being due to Mr. Bulstrode's exertions. Lidgett was the only person still expected. Everyone now sat down, Mr. Bulstrode presiding, pale and self-restrained as usual. Mr. Thesiger, a moderate evangelical, wished for the appointment of his friend Mr. Tyke, a zealous, able man who, officiating at a chapel of ease, had not a cure of souls too extensive to leave him ample time for the new duty. It was desirable that chaplaincies of this kind should be entered on with a fervent intention. They were peculiar opportunities for spiritual influence, and while it was good that a salary should be allotted, there was the more need for scrupulous watching, lest the office should be perverted into a mere question of salary. Mr. Thesiger's manner had so much quiet propriety that objectors could only simmer in silence. Mr. Brooke believed that everybody meant well in the matter. He himself had not attended to the affairs of the infirmary, though he had a strong interest in whatever was for the benefit of Middlemarch, and was most happy to meet the gentlemen present on any public question, you know, Mr. Brooke repeated with his nod of perfect understanding. I am a good deal occupied as a magistrate, and in the collection of documentary evidence, but I regard my time as being at the disposal of the public, and in short, my friends have convinced me that a chaplain with a salary, you know, is a very good thing, and I am happy to be able to come here and vote for the appointment of Mr. Tyke, who, I understand, is an unexceptionable man, apostolic and eloquent and everything of that kind, and I am the last man to withhold my vote under the circumstances, you know. It seems to me that you have been crammed with one side of the question, Mr. Brooke, said Mr. Frank Hawley, who was afraid of nobody and was a Tory, suspicious of electioneering intentions. You don't seem to know that one of the worthiest men we have has been doing duty as chaplain here 4 years without pay, and that Mr. Tyke has proposed to supersede him. Excuse me, Mr. Hawley, said Mr. Bulstrode. Mr. Brooke has been fully informed of Mr. Fairbrother's character and position. By his enemies, flashed out Mr. Hawley. I trust there is no personal hostility concerned here, said Mr. Thesiger. I'll swear there is, though, retorted Mr. Hawley. Gentlemen, said Mr. Bulstrode in a subdued tone, the merits of the question may be very briefly stated, and if anyone present doubts that every gentleman who is about to give his vote has not been fully informed, I can now recapitulate the considerations that should weigh on either side. I don't see the good of that, said Mr. Hawley. I suppose we all know whom we mean to vote for. Any man who wants to do justice does not wait till the last minute to hear both sides of the question. I have no time to lose, and I propose that the matter be put to the vote at once. A brief but still hot discussion followed before each person wrote Tyke or Fairbrother on a piece of paper and slipped it into a glass tumbler, and in the meantime Mr. Bulstrode saw Lidgett enter. I perceive that the votes are equally divided at present, said Mr. Bulstrode in a clear, biting voice. Then, looking up at Lidgett, there is a casting vote still to be given. It is yours, Mr. Lidgett. Will you be good enough to write? The thing is settled now, said Mr. Wrench, rising. We all know how Mr. Lidgett will vote. You seem to speak with some peculiar meaning, sir, said Lidgett rather defiantly, and keeping his pencil suspended. I merely mean that you are expected to vote with Mr. Bulstrode. Do you regard that meaning as offensive? It may be offensive to others, but I shall not desist from voting with him on that account. Lidgett immediately wrote down Tyke. So the Reverend Walter Tyke became chaplain to the infirmary, and Lidgett continued to work with Mr. Bulstrode. He was really uncertain whether Tyke were not the more suitable candidate, and yet his consciousness told him that if he had been quite free from indirect bias, he should have voted for Mr. Fairbrother. The affair of the chaplaincy remained a sore point in his memory as a case in which this petty medium of Middlemarch had been too strong for him. How could a man be satisfied with a decision between such alternatives and under such circumstances? No more than he can be satisfied with his hat, which he has chosen from among such shapes as the resources of the age offer him, wearing it at best with a resignation which is chiefly supported by comparison. But Mr. Fairbrother met him with the same friendliness as before. The character of the publican and sinner is not always practically incompatible with that of the modern Pharisee, for the majority of us scarcely see more distinctly the faultiness of our own conduct than the faultiness of our own arguments or the dullness of our own jokes. But the vicar of St. Botolph's had certainly escaped the slightest tincture of the Pharisee, and by dint of admitting to himself that he was too much as other men were, he had become remarkably unlike them in this, that he could excuse others for thinking slightly of him, and could judge impartially of their conduct even when it told against him. The world has been too strong for me, I know, he said one day to Lidgett, but then I am not a mighty man. I shall never be a man of renown. The choice of Heracles is a pretty fable, but Prodicus makes it easy work for the hero, as if the first resolves were enough. Another story says that he came to hold the distaff, and at last wore the Nessus shirt. I suppose one good resolve might keep a man right if everybody else's resolve helped him. The vicar's talk was not always inspiriting. He had escaped being a Pharisee, but he had not escaped that low estimate of possibilities which we rather hastily arrive at as an inference from our own failure. Lidgett thought that there was a pitiable infirmity of will in Mr. Fairbrother. That's our reading done. Now, what I want to put up on screen right now is a table, and you'll see this table shows all the men who arrived at the meeting before Mr. Bulstrode. So this is from last week's meditation, effectively. You'll see down at the bottom there, I've got the point at which we ended the last meditation. These were the men present, and the numbers on the far left indicate the order in which they spoke. Mr. Wrench and Toller didn't have dialogue as such, although they were reported as speaking to each other, but not speaking aloud so that we, the reader, could know what they were saying, apart from the fact that we know they were calling Mr. Lidgett a jackanapes. But that being said, it was also possible to work out how they voted, and that's from working backwards. This table will get bigger, and I'll show you another version of it later on in this meditation. But right now we know that we've got Wrench, Toller, Sprague, Powderell, Hackbutt, Hawley, Plymdale, and Minchin. And we know that at the moment, with just these men present, if they were to vote now, Mr. Fairbrother would have a clear majority. And that is why the last meditation ended with Mr. Powderell and Mr. Plymdale looking a little anxious, because they were in favor of Mr. Tyke, and from what they could see around them, it didn't seem good news. It didn't seem like things were going to go their way. And of course, Mr. Larcher comes in straight away after that, and he's a Tyke voter, and that's a good thing, but it still doesn't make a majority for Tyke. It still makes a balance of 6 votes to 3 in favor of Fairbrother, right? And then the big names come in. Then Bulstrode arrives, the Reverend Thesiger, and Mr. Brooke. Do we all remember Mr. Brooke? Yes, Dorothea's uncle, the very same. And it appears that he's been recently added into this board of directors. And you can, I don't know, can anybody not tell that Mr. Bulstrode is doing his political homework here, figuring out how can I bolster the vote? He already must know that the majority of long-standing medical men are all for Fairbrother, with very few exceptions, and that he's got a couple of tradesmen who will vote for Tyke, but not very many. And so he's going out of his way, it seems, first of all, to win Lidgett over. That was a project which he worked on, and we shall see that that was successful. But also Mr. Brooke. And of course, Mr. Brooke, it seems, is even easier to persuade, judging from the words that he has to say. But I want to talk more about this. Why has Mr. Brooke decided to get involved out of the clear blue sky? We could say, well, Bulstrode obviously is extremely persuasive, but it is more than that. It is more than that. We need to go back to page 88 of the novel, to the dinner party, which marked that transition away from the story of Dorothea Brooke. She was about to get married, and then we moved over into Middlemarch and met all these characters that we're dealing with now. And Mr. Brooke invited a number of prominent Middlemarch men to that dinner. Prominent, even though they weren't the same social class as he was. They were lower. They were tradesmen, and therefore Mr. Brooke is part of the landed gentry. There is a social divide between them. However, at Mr. Brooke's decision, it can be breached. Men only, though, you'll note. They didn't invite any of their wives, and that was because it would be bad manners to ask his womenfolk, and the women that he invited, Lady Chetham, for example, Mrs. Cadwallader, it would be bad manners to ask them to have to socialize with women of a lower class. I know, the 19th century was a strange place to live, but so Mr. Brooke is spending time with these men he wouldn't normally have to associate with. And the reason is because of his political ambitions. And we get hints of that, don't we? Mrs. Cadwallader mentions it on page 54, Mr. Brooke says something and she just goes, oh, that is a piece of claptrap that you have got ready for the hustings. And I never defined hustings, did I? What is a husting? A husting comes from two Norse terms, hus and ting. Husting. Hus meaning house and ting meaning thing. And you might think thing. Well, it's where we get the modern English word thing from. However, ting meant gathering, assembly. And so it was the place of assembly, effectively. The Danish parliament is known as the Folketing, the People's Assembly. And the earliest English hustings or assembly house was the court in the city of London. That was back in the days of King Alfred, so we're talking the 800s AD. In the 17th and 18th century, however, a husting became a platform built up with a stage in a public space where the political candidates could get up above the crowds and be able to use their voice projection to speak to them all and persuade them to vote for them, one way or the other. And as I show you here from this lovely engraving from probably the late 18th or early 19th century, they were interesting gatherings. There was a lot of commotion. People didn't make it secret how they were going to vote, and that caused a lot of difficulty before we even got to the vote. And it was questionable just how fair and justly conducted some of those elections were. So to summarize, both Mr. Bulstrode and Mr. Brooke have political objectives, and effectively they're combining their efforts to do something for each other. Mr. Brooke is doing something for Mr. Bulstrode to further the cause that Mr. Bulstrode has to get Mr. Tyke in as hospital chaplain. And what Mr. Bulstrode might do for Mr. Brooke, that will be interesting to see, but I'm sure that there is some little arrangement that we haven't yet heard about, but we will. One of my favorite characters in this section is Mr. Hawley, the lawyer, who really gives Mr. Brooke a debate. He's afraid of nothing. He and Mrs. Cadwallader would get along splendidly, I think. Neither of them is afraid of confrontation. Neither of them is afraid of speaking their minds very clearly. Perhaps Mr. Hawley will be running against Mr. Brooke as the Tory candidate. Mr. Brooke, I don't know if he could hold up. If Hawley really did have him all to himself, if he didn't have Mr. Bulstrode there to mediate and say, now, gentlemen, we're going to do things as I say we're going to do them, I wonder if Mr. Brooke's composure would hold up quite so well. And I love this construction of drama by leaving it till the very end for Mr. Lidgett to enter the room when all the other voting has been done, and when Mr. Bulstrode has clearly stated to everyone present that the votes are now even. And this is where I can put up the second table for you all now to have a look at. So this is a very different picture, isn't it? Now we see that all the men have voted. And if we get down to number 10, Bulstrode, he must have been, I suppose, the last person to vote, and realized, and this shows you this was not a secret ballot. Every man wrote on a piece of paper, yes, but it was obvious that Bulstrode could clearly see what was on their piece of paper before they put it in the tumbler. They did not fold it up. There was no hiding behind a barrier. It really does speak volumes to what improvements have been made in electoral system since. Because once you know how someone votes, you can do this kind of psychological pressuring. So what Lidgett is being put under is pressure, because he walks into the room and he's immediately made aware by Bulstrode that the votes are evenly cast. Half for Fairbrother, half for Tyke. And Mr. Lidgett, whatever vote he casts, is the vote that effectively the other men need not have voted. Lidgett's vote is the one that's going to decide who is hospital chaplain. That's an amazing bit of drama, but also it shows the disadvantages of a secret ballot, because would Lidgett have voted differently? He does say that if there were no other pressure on him, he would have voted for Fairbrother. Now, there is pressure to walk into a room, to have all these men staring at you, to have Bulstrode there watching you and making it clear that your vote's the deciding one, to have other men implicate you, as did happen to, I've already forgotten who it was that kindly pointed out to Mr. Lidgett that he expected that Lidgett would just vote for Tyke and that would be it. It was Mr. Wrench, wasn't it? He rose. He figured I might as well go now. Here's Lidgett. He's going to vote for Tyke. So will have Tyke. And Lidgett takes offense to that. And somehow I think the combined pressure of Bulstrode being there and Lidgett's own arrogance that a man should question why he's doing things the way he's doing. And I think he voted for Tyke under just that, the pressure of that alone. And that is interesting, that he, to me, he capitulates rather easily. I don't feel that he's a man with a really strong will. That's just my take on this. And it makes Lidgett very different because I don't see in the other men present that they were necessarily voting because they were under pressure from anyone else. In fact, they voted the way they wanted to vote in spite enduring comments from some of the others. It was notable, though, that those who voted for Fairbrother were not tradesmen. They were professionals. Tradesmen might have felt compelled to vote for Tyke in case they needed the assistance from Mr. Bulstrode as banker. The apothecaries are the only exception. They are considered tradespeople. But I think for the apothecaries, they had to consider more the way Sprague and Minchin were going to vote. Because if you voted against the physicians, then when the physicians came to recommending which apothecary one might go to obtain drugs, because of course physicians did not dispense drugs, what if they started to say, oh, don't go to Mr. Wrench. We don't think he's very good. And the only reason they're saying it is perhaps because Mr. Wrench voted for Tyke and they didn't want him to vote for Tyke. So they have to consider which way to vote based on what would make their lives easiest. So I suppose in a way there was a little pressure there on the part of the apothecaries. If they had preferred Tyke, they couldn't really be free to vote for him. And perhaps you could say, well, the tradesmen, if they had money with Bulstrode, and they almost certainly did, then they were under a certain amount of pressure as well, although they seemed to give religious reasons for voting for Tyke. Lidgett doesn't have the freedom to defy Bulstrode at this point in his career. He's too soon come to Middlemarch. He's nobody. He has no influence, no authority that he can wield. He couldn't stand up on his own. He needs Bulstrode's support right now. And so he really doesn't get much choice. But nevertheless, I think he might have, if he had stood up to Mr. Bulstrode, that would have sent a signal to the senior physicians and to the apothecaries, and he might have won some support from them, and that might have been more helpful to him than Bulstrode's support. We shall see. And Mr. Fairbrother, as he promised when Lidgett first visited him, doesn't hold Lidgett's vote against him, continues to be friendly with him. And that must stick a little bit with Lidgett, because as the narrator of the novel says, Mr. Fairbrother doesn't appear to have any tint of the Pharisee in him. And we need to look at that, because she uses the term modern Pharisee. I'm not sure exactly what she might mean by that, but by referring to publicans and sinners, she's making a specific biblical allusion, and that is to a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9. And I thought, why don't we read that? Because it's good. Not everybody has the biblical context. Some people are very familiar with the New Testament, others not so much. So some of us already had the story kind of in our heads in ever so many words. For those who don't, we're going to just read Matthew chapter 9 and verses 9 through to 13 to get this bit that the narrator is making an allusion to. It says, "Then as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he arose and followed him. And so it was, as Jesus sat at the table in the house, that behold, many tax collectors and sinners," in the Old King James that would have been publicans and sinners, "came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?' But when Jesus heard that, he said to them, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So it's interesting there that Jesus makes an allusion to physicians. We are in the middle of a vote on a hospital chaplain with a number of physicians. Lidgett is a physician, and it's just interesting because there is hypocrisy in this scene. There are people doing things for hypocritical reasons. And Lawley, the lawyer, tries to bring this out, doesn't he? He doesn't suggest, he states outright that he thinks there's some hostility here, some personal hostility. Reverend Thesiger doesn't like it. He says, "So surely there isn't." Lawley says, "Well, I think there is, and I think there is." Bulstrode, when he expresses himself private about Mr. Fairbrother to Lidgett, he uses very strong language. Let's go back and look at that again. Lidgett has a meeting with Bulstrode, you'll remember in chapter 13, in which Bulstrode asks him, he says, "The building, that is, the old infirmary, stands in Mr. Fairbrother's parish. You know Mr. Fairbrother?" And Lidgett says, "I have seen him. He gave me his vote. I must call to thank him. He seems a very bright, pleasant little fellow, and I understand he is a naturalist." And Mr. Bulstrode replies by saying, "Mr. Fairbrother, my dear sir, is a man deeply painful to contemplate." and so I feel that Mr. Bulstrode is careful with his wording, and yet he really came out quite strongly there with a man that was deeply painful to contemplate, and then goes on to talk about how he simply lacks the ability, the spiritual abilities that Mr. Bulstrode is expecting of a clergyman. But all this is so much hypocrisy. If we go back to the section that I read from the Gospel of Matthew, the publicans and the sinners, the tax collectors, men who were hired by the Roman government to take money from the Jewish population there, they were usually Jewish themselves. This created an incredible antipathy, as you can imagine, and they were rumored to extort some of that tax money for themselves, with the Romans turning a bit of a blind eye, because by allowing that to happen, they naturally sowed a certain discord amongst the Jewish population itself. And if you sow discord within a population itself, then you can continue to rule them. They don't unify against you so easily. So it's a tactic, if you like. But Mr. Bulstrode isn't a great deal different than a tax collector. He's the man that holds all these people's money. He extends credit to them. Their financial viability rests on him. And any time that you deal with money, there are going to be possibilities for corruption. And I think it's just so interesting that Eliot's narrator alludes to this particular passage in Matthew, which mentions both physicians and tax collectors, and this gathering of directors really is a mixture mainly of medical men and, of course, Mr. Bulstrode with his incredible financial power behind him, which is the power that is probably keeping the tradesmen trading. It's all just so intertwined and inescapable. And there's something pharisaical about that. Mr. Bulstrode holds great power over a lot of these men. And they know it, and some of them are all right with it, and some of them deeply, deeply resent the power and the influence that he has, but nevertheless, it's there. What makes Fairbrother totally different from these men is that he does not try to hold authority that he should not. He does not try to extend himself or see himself as greater than he actually is. And he expresses that to Lidgett because they're becoming friends. They seem to be getting together more for social purposes, and he's so frank with Lidgett. I think it's interesting how he refers to Greek mythology. That's interesting that he should refer to Greek mythology. Eliot's narrator should be the one to quote the Gospels, nevertheless. Because, I mean, we don't really know how devout exactly Fairbrother is. He's not talked about religion as it in terms of what it means to him personally. We haven't really had to go there yet. I don't know if we will. We shall see. But he certainly does admire people's honesty and truthfulness. I think that's why he admires Mary Garth. But he talks about Heracles, and he talks about a particular myth of Heracles. When Heracles was a young man, apparently, I mean, of course, it's a myth, he came to a point where he was given a decision between a life of ease and luxury and pleasuring of the senses, which was represented by a woman whose name was Coquia, And then he was offered the choice of a life that was more dutiful, that would mean sacrifice, would probably be a difficult life. And that was represented by another woman called Arete, who represents virtue. Heracles chose, of course he did, he chose virtue. And I think Fairbrother's frustration is he says, wow, wouldn't it be something if at one point in your whole life you could make a decision and that's it, it's made. You don't continually have to make it the same decision at different points of your life. The truth is, life forks off like that really often. And you can make one choice when you're 18, but you can bet that at 19, some other circumstance will come along and you'll be making a similar choice, but you'll have to make it again. And that goes on and on and on and on. Throughout our lives, we're always making a choice between the easy way and the more difficult way, and which are we going to take at any given moment. And Fairbrother says, oh, if only it were so easy. And Heracles, he just makes that one decision right then, and then he's done. All done. That decision-making of Heracles inspired many, many, many paintings. I think, excuse me for being cynical, but I think because it allowed the artists to represent Kakia, the woman who is standing in for all elements of vice and sensual pleasure. And our thumbnail today is one such painting. And you can see that there's great pleasure, I think, taken in depicting Kakia. Arete, not so much. She's usually fully clothed. Not as interesting as Kakia, who virtually wears nothing in most of these paintings. So you do wonder what was the patron who asked for the painting to be done really hoping to have something to help him make the better decision? Not sure. And with all this, what does Mr. Lidgett conclude? He has misgivings about himself, but the funny thing is, like a true Pharisee, he doesn't see himself clearly. He doesn't like the mistake he made, but he doesn't equate it as being the same thing as Mr. Fairbrother. He ends by regretting the fact that Fairbrother's got such an infirmity of will. And you think, oh, pot calling the kettle black. Lidgett, I'm not sure how much will he actually has to do what he knows is the best thing to do, as opposed to something that he's moved to do by a little bit of pressure in the moment. He seems to be a much more impulsive creature than he understands himself to be. And that I think is the Pharisaical point that we're really meant to take back with us, is that Lidgett is a hypocrite. He sees himself as more decisive and having a stronger will than Mr. Fairbrother, when in fact Mr. Fairbrother, it seems to me, is keeping to the standard he sets himself. So he's honest in terms of what he says he's going to do, he does. And Lidgett, not so much. I think he says he has an intention, but he really has no will to hold up that intention. Every time a tiny bit of pressure or a distraction. So I just see in him a great weakness of will, and it just seems the zenith of hypocrisy to look at another man and go, and point out and notice the fault that they have, which is the fault that you have. It is that other New Testament saying that why, now I'm not going to think of it. It's about the mote being in your brother's eye when you've got a beam in your own eye. I'm sure that people are going to tell me where that is in the comments. So we shall leave the meditation there for today. That's it for July. We will come back in August, at which point we will reacquaint ourselves with Dorothea and her new husband and some other characters that we've met before. So until then, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.